This talk, I'm sure you know, is Beyond Thunderdome, debating the effectiveness of different user research techniques. The genesis of this talk is basically lots of people say, we like doing this is very useful. And what they're never really telling you is this is very useful compared to doing nothing is implicit in their argument, but nothing is not your only choice. You have a choice of a wide variety of different tools in the toolbox, and the question is, what's best when and why? And so stop saying it's better to have a hammer when you actually have a whole toolbox and you say, actually, no, that's a screw. That's going to be a lot of effort for very little work. And you're not actually talking about the fact that there are different properties of research problems and therefore different tools to solve different research problems. So that's the genesis of it. Unlike the original Thunderdome, 2 men are going to enter, 2 men are going to leave completely unscathed. So if you came looking for blood, that's okay. They're willing to hit you guys, but they're just not willing to hit each other. Okay, so the goals of this talk is one is just to be informational. Again, is that, in my opinion, a lot of people are having a very sort of, I'm advocating this approach as opposed to I'm advocating doing smart things with user research in a holistic sense. It's also to be motivational. The goal is actually to get you to start thinking about why you're doing the particular activity you're doing and whether that's the best suited one for this, and also hopefully to open a few eyes as to what other opportunities exist for user research that you're currently not taking advantage of. It's also intended to be entertainal. In some sense. So in some sense, I have pushed them to take more extreme positions than they ordinarily would. In some cases, they're just going to lie and act like they believe something that they don't, just for sheer entertainment value. We'll see how much that request to lie has come through. By the way, do not practice this at home. So organizing principles of this. There are 2 main things that I do that I think are pretty much what you should think. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This is why marketing runs focus groups. For every known problem and question they want to answer, they run a focus group for it. This is a weird thing to me. But if all you have is a hammer, and that's the one thing you learned in MBA school, then everything looks like a nail to you. Second thing is, if something exists, it exists in some amount. If it exists in some amount, it can be measured. That was one of the early founders of psychology, said something very close to that. I cleaned it up because I don't like the way he phrased it. But anyway, the idea of it is Thorndike's in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It's basically, your job as researchers is to be able to measure things like liberty and fun and confusion. Big words, nebulous words, and as key step through it, find a way to take it down to a measurement that means something that represents the idea that you care about. And if you're not good at that, you're not going to be very good at research, or at least certainly not at developing research techniques. But that's the fundamental problem. Take a concept, I want to know, is this fun, and break it down in a way that you can actually measure approximates of fun so that you get something meaningful out of it. Yes, I'm eating into your time. I see that look. So anyway, let me go into intros. First, we have Mike Armbender, also known as Mike Armbender, which I am jealous of at this moment. He's an experimental psychologist at Valve. He did the all caps on experimental. He does not have a couch. He is not a clinical psychologist. He is not interested in how you feel specifically. If he did have a couch, however, it would look like this. All right, so John Hobson over here from Bungie. He's a user research lead at Bungie. His job is to make designers do this. and you need to hurt them to help them. Okay, and real quick about me, I started the GER effort at Microsoft back in '97, and then we started the SIG in 2008 as a means of trying to collect people who do this work in the various companies. Almost every major publisher I'm aware of now has something. What that something looks like or whatever, it's a separate question, but they're all starting things and trying to move forward in this field, and it felt like the right time to create a professional organization around it. So hence the track here. I started Run User Experience in 2008, which is a consultancy which, not surprisingly, does user research and design for games. And I get people to hire me to do this to their designers. So unlike these guys, which have the easier version, someone buys a game, they take it home, they're kind of stuck with it. Whereas for me, it's like more like an arcade. They have to put a quarter in, and if they don't like what they did, they don't have to put another quarter in. So my job's harder, essentially. I look good if we look at it this way. So anyway, let's move on to the evaluation framework. So we're going to talk about how to compare research methods against each other to determine effectiveness, and that implies that you actually know how to evaluate whether something is effective or not, and so we have 5 criteria for that. So one is that it's representative, that the phenomena you are testing is in fact the phenomena of interest. If you're measuring fun, that you have some way of arranging for fun to occur and with the people that you care about. The phenomena represents something you care about. If this is wrong, don't bother doing anything else. If you can't get the right people and you can't create the right situation, if you can't get the right people to play the game, you can't do the work. Just go ahead and stop. So if it's not representative, it just doesn't matter. Accurate. that the results you get actually reflect the people you tested. So they meant to say, I don't like it, and you actually managed to get in your data that they didn't like it. That if it doesn't have that representation that is not accurate to what the people said, it's not going to be very useful to do. It's actually going to be dangerous to do. Specific. It's got to be precise enough. You can't just say, they don't like the game. Not helpful, really. You need to say, it is this thing right here that they don't like, so that to make the fix easier and easier to do, or in some ways harder and harder to screw up the fix. Timely. If it doesn't arrive when the team is working on it, then it's basically useless. You do not have 3 months. You do not have 9 months for most research questions. You have approximately 4 days before the build is different. Can you deliver that in that time frame? And then there's cost effective. Essentially, one way I pose it to potential clients is, if I could give you 67 things wrong with your game right now, what would you pay for it? And if I give them a number of what it would cost that's well above that number, then the answer is, then we're not going to buy that information from you. And looking at it as a sales transaction in that fashion actually changes how long you'll take, how many bells and whistles you want to do, because essentially some information is worth $100,000. Some information is worth 20. Some information is not worth anything. And thinking of it like that, I think, will advance your cause on how to do applied research, which is very different than basic research. And Keith added to my crap and gave actionable, which was implicit to me, but actually I like it explicit, so I added it as, okay, now there's 6 criteria. And then I added a new one after looking over this after about 7 years, and we added motivational. Essentially, the goal is not to find out true things. The goal is to get true things into games. And if the results you get do not motivate designers to make changes because they do not understand it or they do not believe it, then really you've done very little. Truth is only the stepping stone to getting to usefulness in a game. So the results have to persuade someone to do something differently when they sit down at their desk. If it fails to do that, then all you learned is this great truth that in fact is going to be true of the experience when they ship, because they've done nothing with the data. Okay, so let's go to an overview. We're going to debate basically 7 types of research. Behavioral observations, metrics, surveys, eye tracking, think aloud, physiological measures, and focus groups. And at this point, we'll turn it over to John.
So our first method, can everybody hear me? So our first method is behavioral observation, and this is basically watching real players play your game. This is a picture of Marcus Lito, one of the design leads at Bungie, sort of looming over a participant, watching him play Halo 3 in the playtest lab. And I love this method. We can step forward. So there's a bunch of great reasons to do behavioral observation. It's quick, it's simple, there's no technology involved, it's free, there's no equipment to buy. It's very unambiguous. You're watching the person playing, you see them get stuck. That was a true thing. There's no interpretation going on. And I have in here requires no training. There are obviously people who are better at this than others, but just be able to keep your mouth shut and watch, not take any training.
And actually, we're not going to debate this method because it is our the single most useful technique that we have. We're all about trying to observe and record and kind of quantify and analyze and interpret human behavior, and direct observation is the best tool we have. So this is more just kind of reminding everybody that all of the techniques that we're going to talk about afterwards, I guess with a couple exceptions, are kind of supplementary to this primary technique of watching people play the game that you're making.
Okay, so this is the bedrock. Everything, in some sense, comes back to this. What did they do, and how do you know that?
So I'll talk about metrics really quickly as well. By metrics, we refer to the selection, recording, analysis, and interpretation of game telemetry. So recording of game statistics, what players are doing, when they're doing it, how they're doing it, and so forth. So, there's baseline metrics like health, ammo, progression through a level, and then you can get more granular in terms of enemies killed, how enemies were killed, time between enemy kills, things like that, and so forth. So benefits of metrics, you get objective recordings of behavior. Instead of saying that, this level was harder than this level, well, you can actually quantify it. You can say that, people end up dying 53% more on this level than this other level. It doesn't mean that means you should take that as gospel, but it's important, to obviously have context, but it gives you a way of quantifying behavior. It's also the only unobtrusive playtesting methodology we have. This may be its single most promising feature, right? There's no interference with the playtest, so there's no introduction of bias. There's no, even direct observation. If someone is watching you, right, your behavior may change. With metrics, at least, it's all happening in the background, so there's no there's no real, I guess, bias introduced into the player's behavior, unless you happen to tell them we're recording their stats, in which case maybe something could go wrong. They're also good for creating baselines and tracking changes over time, right? If you know that you have a level and, again, people die X% of the time, and then you make a change and people die X plus Y% of the time, okay, well, now you have a measurable difference in the change you made to the level, and that can be useful, extremely useful to game design. Also great for seeing aggregate trends and a great tool for game balancing, again, because you're quantifying kind of behavior in game.
And again, this is not a technique that we're going to disagree on. I love metrics. I use them all the time. The one, yeah, sorry.
It's coming, don't worry.
We're working up to it.
Yeah.
The one downside to metrics, though, is they do take a lot of run-up. I mean, it can take months to get the right hooks put into the game and all working, and there's a lot of expertise involved in there. So it can be a lot of work to put in metrics. It can take a lot of evangelism to get designers to put in metrics. Very few researchers put in their own hooks into the game to record data. You have to convince somebody else that it's worth doing. You have to convince some data person to collect the data for you. There's a lot of work involved. So they're wonderful. I love them. They are a little pricey in terms of the amount of wear and tear on the research team. Okay, actually, things we disagree on. So, surveys. So,
Kind of.
So a lot of researchers use long online surveys as a way of collecting a large volume of data all at once from many players. Now, this is a picture actually from Halo 3 testing again. Oh, sorry. So there's a player playing a game on the left monitor, and on the right monitor, he's filling out a survey about the game as he goes along. There are a bunch of pluses to this. Surveys are on automated testing methods, so they're consistent. The players get asked the same question every time, the same way. It works in parallel, so you...
Well, so...
Okay.
So I guess so it's true that surveys are consistent, but that also highlights one issue with them is that they're static. So if you end up asking a question wrong, or a question is misinterpreted, or you end up forgetting a question, then the survey data becomes, rendered, I guess, somewhat useless.
Yeah. And, I mean, like any other testing method, this can be done wrong, but assuming you come up with good survey questions, which takes some expertise, you can collect some great data. And there really isn't a forgetting going on because you're working up the survey before the test. You're not on the spot during the study trying to remember all of the things you need to ask them. You've built it ahead of time and you've let it run during the test. So again, surveys work in parallel. You can have an infinite number of people fill out your survey at once you've built it. So that's great for large-scale betas, large-scale playtesting. And it requires minimum supervision from the researcher per participant. So it's as easy to supervise 100 people doing a survey as it is to supervise one. You're just sort of keeping them all sitting at their desk doing what they're doing.
Right. So I absolutely agree that surveys are require minimal supervision, but that's also highlights a flaw with the fact that, especially if you end up doing these, you could bring in 100 people into the lab and that's costly, or if you end up, doing an online survey, well, then all of a sudden there's almost no control over the user base, right? It can be a self-selecting population that ends up introducing bias into the results, and so it can be difficult to ensure, especially when, surveying large groups of people, which you kind of do when you're dealing with sensitive measures like surveys, that you're actually recruiting, a random sample or a sample that's going to give you, results that you can be confident in.
Yeah. And there are some techniques you can use to make sure your participants aren't packing your surveys, that they aren't responding multiple times. You can correlate their survey responses with their gameplay telemetry. Say, okay, we're not going to accept any opinions on the sniper rifle from people who haven't actually used the sniper rifle, things like that. So the smarter your survey tool, the better you can do. And to sort of swap these points in order, you can integrate your surveys into the game and have them actually pop up as they're playing. Okay, you just got to kill with the sniper rifle. What do you think of this weapon? And ask them at the moment, right when they are playing the game and right when they've had the experience.
You can do that. And I think this will branch into an argument we'll probably get into with more discussion on later on. But interrupting the gameplay can be a negative experience. I think we can save kind of further discussion of that for down the line. In terms of, you mentioned the specific question of how did you feel about the sniper rifle? That also highlights another, I guess, concern with surveys, that you need to be extra careful that what you're asking is what the survey question is saying is what you intend to ask, and that the people responding to the survey understand what it is you're trying to ask. If you ask someone, how did you enjoy the game, but you have a different definition of enjoyment than they did, then you're getting a different answer and your data can be invalid. And so you mentioned training, but it's also something that should be hammered home, is that it is really important to make sure that what you are measuring is what you intend to measure is what you are actually measuring.
Absolutely. And the final thing I wanted to mention about surveys is that they are an incredibly flexible tool. I mean, there are only certain things you can record with metrics. There are only certain things you can record with physiological measures. With a survey, you could ask any question that could come out of your mouth. You want to ask about the art style. You want to ask about the aesthetics. There are incredibly complex questions that you can only get at by just asking the participant the question. And so, yes, there are ways to do bad questions, but it's a very flexible tool that can get at almost any question in game design.
So you absolutely can ask, any question you want. Of course you can. But I think I guess the issue with surveys is that you can't always get all of the kinds of answers that you want. Surveys are very good for quantifying preference and for rank ordering and enforcing choice. If you ask someone how much do they like a game, you can have it on a scale and look at trends over time, and all those are benefits. But beyond that, when you're restricting answers, to kind of pre-selected choices or pre-selected rankings, it can be difficult to kind of get the granularity you want. And yes, I know that there are open-ended responses, but again, those require a lot of extra work. And again, when answers are unconstrained, it's sometimes difficult to actually parcel out meaningful data.
Yeah. And open-ended questions are both a blessing and a curse. They produce an amazing amount of data. I think we calculated at one point during some of the Halo playtests, we were producing 50,000 words of open-ended comments in a weekend. But you can split those down to just the people you're interested in, like just looking at the open-ended comments from the people who complained about a particular place and a particular mission. So the guy who died a lot, let's look at his comments and see what he said about his experience. So you can pare them down to just the important comments using a little bit of intelligence. Okay. How are we doing on time?
Screw it. You'll stay, right? Okay. All right, let's go.
All right, so I'll argue for eye tracking. Eye tracking is basically using a camera, can be typically these days it's remote, that's shining light off your eyeball and kind of calculating where your eyes are looking on a display. So what you get is an overlay of a participant's gaze on what they're actually looking at on screen in real time as it's happening. So the things I like about eye tracking are it's a unique methodology that gives us information we couldn't get from any other metric. So it's the only way we know of to acquire a real-time kind of attention, or I guess metric of attention in real time. So what are people looking at? What are they attending to? What are they fixating on as people are playing the game? And that kind of data is not discoverable through any other means.
And I'll insert here real quick. Eye tracking is a correlate of attention. You're not actually measuring attention in the brain somewhere. You're measuring something they're doing, a behavior that correlates with attention. That what they're attending to, they probably are looking at. That's not always true, especially with expert gamers tend to be more focused on what's important and picking up other things with their peripheral vision. So depending on your population, this may be more or less useful.
Sure, absolutely. And attention precedes eye movements. That's been shown for a while. So, I mean, where an eye is looking, the attention may have been there half a second before, but it's the lag time is not such that you're going to lead to gross distortions. You cannot actually actively attend outside your fixation for periods of multiple seconds. You're definitely processing in your periphery, and that's fine. And you can pick up motion transients. And of course, what John is saying is true. And expert players are going to have different eye movement patterns than the novice players. And that's actually an interesting question. Some data you can get with eye tracking that can help you kind of flatten up a learning curve.
You can also just ask them if they're experts.
Well, I guess the point is not that asking whether they're experts, right? It's understanding how they consume the game, how they consume the interface, right, or how they can visually consume the game, right? And in that case, instead of saying, well, how did ask someone how they became an expert, and they can give you an hour-long, spiel on it, or you can say, hey, actually, they only look at their, they're actually not actively checking their health. They check their health every, 50 seconds, and novices check it every 5 seconds. You could tell us with an eye tracker, and then you could figure out ways to kind of help novices be made more aware that health is less important, or to become more efficient at checking their health. I guess that was the point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I guess other pros of eye tracking are it's an outstanding tool for interface analysis. So what you can do is you have interfaces are usually static on screen, so you can compute the percentage that heat map in the previous slide. I don't know if we can flip back to it real quick. I mean that's. You can see kind of where people are fixating in the display, over a period of time, and get an idea of how people are consuming the interface. And you can also obviously look at the real-time overlay of the gaze positions as they go along.
Now the problem, of course, is yes, this is good for interface analysis. The best tool for interface analysis is the player's ability to actually use the UI. Can they actually do what the UI asks them to do? Can they, say, invite a player to join them in a multiplayer game? There's a success metric there, a behavioral metric, that really is the ultimate measure. And if something, I mean, this is all great, record it, whatever, but the best metric is, can the player do what they need to do? And my argument would be that if they can't do what they need to do, well, you already know, okay, you know there's a problem then. And if they can do what they need to do anyway, well, why did I need this too? Because if it's not stopping them from doing what they need to do, is it a real problem that will take priorities over the other real problems in the game?
So yeah, I mean, I'll freely grant that behavior is the most important metric, and I think we would both agree on that, and that's fine. Eye tracking is not, again, is not it's a supplementary tool that what it does is give you granularity into why interfaces may have failings. This is the question. So you say, all right, can someone invite a friend? Okay, well, let's figure out why. An eye tracker lets you do that, or can help you do that. If you ask someone about an interface and they say, yeah, this interface is too tough to use, okay, what does that mean? You could spend an hour poking at them, or you could actually look at their data and see, hey, actually, they frequently make eye movements from the mini-map and to the health, and they're located on opposite ends of the screen. And so long eye movements we know are fatiguing, and so that causes people to have less enjoyable experiences. And okay, so that's something that you could get from eye tracking that you wouldn't get just by asking someone their impressions of the interface.
And yes, it's nice to know. In my experience, very few actual user problems are mysteries. It's once you know the problem's there, it's like, oh, of course that's what's going on. So yes, this is useful in the situation where it's like, well, why is that a problem? But in my experience, that's a small subset of all the user problems in games.
Okay, and I guess moving on. So other things you can do with eye tracking are get player scene interpretations. You can look at the order of fixation of people when they go into a room to see how they prioritize the content on screen and use that to inform game design decisions.
Of course, one of the complexities here is that in a moving 3D game, what's in the corner of the room may be different for every participant. So aggregating this data across different participants who are playing different games or each playing their own game, is very complex. Knowing that they're looking at the left side of the screen, is there an enemy there or not? That requires a lot of data mining and extra complication to figure out what the participant's actually looking at in a 3D game.
So that's an excellent point, and it absolutely could require a lot of work, but it doesn't have to. So there are systems now that let you, if you have, again, you need people willing, you need a programmer willing to do this, but we actually integrated our game events into the eye tracker, so we actually can tag one specific enemy's appearance screen and their locations, and that's actually fed right into the data stream, and that took about 3 or 4 hours of programming. Granted, yes. I mean, I don't want to dismiss the point because it's a valid one. Like, eye tracking does require analysis, and it can be quite sophisticated analysis, and you have to be really careful about what you're interpreting. But with in some cases minimal overhead, 5 to 10 hours here, you can actually set up quite robust systems that will let you do kind of the more complex analyses that we're hoping we can get from this process. And then I guess final point is, again, this is something, and I'll, John can pick this apart too, but, you can get rudimentary insight into cognitive processes, which is interesting. In Portal, we use the eye tracker to, track human behavior, and we could tell just by quantifying the eye movements whether someone was scanning for a particular solution, like they knew what they had to do, but they were just looking for a wall to place the portal on, or they were in just freeform exploration mode, not aware of the solution. And that behavior, knowing when those behaviors occur, helped us design better levels and made a better game.
And to repeat myself, you could also just ask them, and that's actually our next topic. So I think we can go into that, which I think all your objections apply.
Yes. We'll find out why I don't like asking people.
Okay. So this is again. So this method is generally referred to as think aloud when it's in the usability lab. And the idea is that the players are maintaining a stream of consciousness monologue as they play the game. I like this, I don't like this sucks, why is that door closed, how come this isn't working? They're talking to themselves and you as they play the game. This is a picture from an old picture from Halo 3 testing, so that's Chris Marino, who's now at Zynga, sitting at the control panel, and Francois watching her run a participant through the usability lab. And so you can see the participant up there in the screen, and he's playing the game and talking through everything he experiences as he plays the game. So the reasons why I love this method, it's again cheap, fast, requires no equipment. They're just talking as they play. There's no sort of particular setup. We talk a lot about one-way mirrors and special lab setups. You don't actually need any of that. You just have a player playing the game, talking as they play. Again, it's a very flexible method, so It can theoretically catch anything that affects the player. They just have to verbalize it. There are things that can't be tracked by eye tracking or other methods, but they can be verbalized. Sorry. It's a debate.
Okay.
Like audio?
No, you're fine. Okay, so and I think this method is kind of where John and I have our biggest disagreements. And again, you'll see kind of like the same themes popping up in the way we treat each of these metrics. My problems with the Think Aloud method are that it's intrusive and it changes the gameplay experience. It's not naturalistic. I know. Just 30 seconds, then you can go. I know. That was a little bit, I know. When we're playtesting our games, we want our players to play the games as if they're playing at home, without somebody watching over them, without them creating an artificial experience where they're like, oh, this is what I'm doing. We don't want them playing for an audience, because when they're playing at home, they're not playing for an audience. With the Think Aloud method, they're playing for an audience, and that is going to change their behavior. There is no way around it. And so what that leads to is biased or distorted data, and that's a problem. You can account for that, but what that does is fundamentally change the gameplay experience. And at least in my experience at Valve, we've gotten messier data, noisier data, and more invalid data when we've had people do Think Aloud.
And my response is that the experience changes the instant you're in the building. They're testing a Bungie game in a Bungie building. Their experience has changed. They know there's an audience. That's the whole point. I mean, they wouldn't be there if you weren't watching them play. And yes, this does change the experience a little bit, but games aren't normally played in isolation tanks. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I play a game, I'm pausing it constantly. I'm talking to my wife. I'm leaning over and doing something else. I'm not playing the game as a single unbroken experience.
So I don't know if the point is not that it's an unbroken experience. I mean, it's fine to let people pause and discuss in a multiplayer game and let them interact as they would. The point is that, again, when you're playing at home, you're not trying to, well, maybe you're trying to impress your wife. I don't know, but you're not trying to impress your wife, or you kind of, I guess you're not acting in a way where you're aware that someone is kind of judging or observing your behavior.
And so there's two responses to that. One is that the point is not that this doesn't distort the game experience. Yes, there's a little distortion because they're talking. They're doing an additional cognitive task that's actually probably going to make them a little worse at the game than they would be normally, because they're spending part of their brain keeping up this monologue. But they're in the lab, so they're probably being a little more cautious than they would be normally. So they're probably playing the game a little better than they would be normally. So it tends to wash out and produce a fairly realistic experience. My second point is, we're not actually trying to produce a realistic experience in the lab. We're trying to find problems that will affect people in realistic situations. Those are different tasks. Think of it like going to the gym. Lifting weights in the gym is not a realistic simulation of how you use your muscles. But the muscles you build up doing that are then useful in realistic situations. So you're using an artificial situation to find problems that are then useful in the need to be fixed to produce a good naturalistic experience.
It's a fair point. I think a problem, though, is that people tend to not see that distinction, and people tend to mistake the behavior that happens in the lab with behavior that will happen in game, and are not making and again are not able to kind of understand the biases and distortions that are at play and account for them. It's us going back and forth around kind of the same point. It's whether or not the distortions are large enough to affect kind of the way the game is developed, or they're not. And we have different experiences, and again, the whole point is to kind of let people know the pros and cons of these different methods. But it's definitely something to be aware of, that when you change the gameplay experience, that you need to account for the fact that it is not the way people will be playing your game at home, and it's not the way your game will be perceived at home, and it is not the way that maybe you should be developing your game. So.
Okay, so to rush through our last few points on this one. Think Aloud allows for follow-up questions. So the person says, boy, that sucked. You can stop and say, what's going on? Why was that a problem? You can say, they encounter a situation you never thought of having a research question for. You can ask a question at that moment. If you have a survey or some other methodology that's all sort of pre-built and running automatically, you can't actually change the research methodology at the moment to take advantage of serendipitous situations. The other thing is Think Aloud allows for absolutely unique insights because you're hearing what they think. It's as direct a method of getting at what players think as we have. And finally, it's an incredibly impactful and motivating methodology. There are very few things that motivate a designer to go back to his desk and fix something than sitting in the lab, watching a player suffer in real time, complaining at them. I mean, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to worry about this, but in a real world where they have a million other demands on their time, having something that motivates them to go back and fix a problem is really important.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Although, and just as a contrast, I think the most motivating technique for us is actually we tend to because we tend to discount what people say because people have lied to our faces quite a bit in these techniques. I mean, like their behavior they say one thing and their behavior is another. It ends up being kind of we kind of go by behavior and kind of not what people say. But I do fully grant the point that it can be motivating. One final, I guess, concern I want to bring up is that if you are doing think aloud, right, instead of being able to run multiple subjects at once, there's a one-to-one relationship between the user researcher and the subject, so it is somewhat less efficient. I mean, not just counting data you can get from it, but again, when thinking about costs, it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll talk about physiological measurements. So basically, this is just the recording of any physiological or biological signal from the player as they play the game. Some examples of this are heart rate, skin conductance, facial expressions, body posture, muscle tension, body temperature. I guess, I mean, there's a wide array of signals that people can use to kind of get insight into a player's emotion or a player's feeling or a player's sentiment as they're playing the game. So what do you get with physiological measurements? What you get are more objective measurements of player state. You can ask someone, how much did you like that? And they can say, oh, I really liked it. Okay, but if you're actually measuring, their body's physiological response, you can quantify that and get a measurement of how they're feeling and what they're doing and what they mean when they say they like that. So it's a question of being able to kind of have a benchmark for what someone means when they say they like a game or they don't like a game or they're frustrated by a game or they're engaged by a game or so forth.
And usually we're not asking for just a yes or no answer. We're asking for it to quantify their preference.
Have we moved on to the pros yet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm a little slow.
And so generally you're comparing, okay, do they say this game is a 9 out of 10, this mission is a 9 out of 10, the last mission was an 8 out of 10. That's generally a pretty good indicator that they liked one mission more than another. And that's usually good enough for most research purposes. We don't need sort of ultra fine details between those two.
So, I mean, I guess in the hypothetical example, an 8 versus 9 could be enough, and it could not be enough. And I think, I mean, as user researchers, I think all of us in here, are confident we could help someone make a good game. But if we want to help someone make a great game, then, maybe there are things that we need to poke at. I mean, again, I don't think, these are different tools in the toolbox, right? And so physiological measurements are not the end-all, be-all, but having not just an objective measurement of player state, but actually a real-time measurement of how someone is experiencing the game, right? That is, again, something you don't get from any other methodology, and it's something that, is very, very useful in terms of how people are emotionally consuming your game.
And it does give you greater resolution, but the important point to me is what is that greater resolution buying you in terms of actual problems that need to be fixed? So if it's a major problem in a mission, it's probably salient enough that the participant will either mention it at the time or they'll mention it later. If it's actually a real problem, they can bring it up. This may pick up smaller problems that wouldn't normally surface in those verbal reports, but by definition, those smaller problems are probably less important. And I've never, ever run a research study and gotten every single problem I discovered fixed. There's always a few things we say, okay, yes, we know it's a problem. It's not important enough to fix this time around. We only have a week. We can't do it. So my argument is that this greater resolution mostly lets you pick up more sort of sub-threshold problems that, okay, now we know, but we already have a whole bunch more important problems to fix.
So I guess I would disagree that you pick up sub-threshold problems. And I think that relying too much on someone's description of their experience to tell you the problems, I think is going to lead you astray. I think what stuff like physiological measures do is they let you know, if you can see a spike in negative arousal, when an enemy appears on screen, but that it's highly likely, and we've actually had this experience, right, where people responded negatively to enemies in Left 4 Dead 2, but it never came up in playtest, but we could see these spikes and we're like, why is this happening? I'm not going to say which enemies, we'll keep that secret, but we saw these spikes in arousal, and so it's something that never came up in verbal descriptions, think aloud, or Q&A. We never thought to ask it, but we saw these negative spikes, and then we were able to go back and figure out why. So I think the notion of the value you get out of it, I think, is dependent upon, again, time you're willing to spend into it or time you're willing to put into it. But I don't think it's fair to say that the problems you will uncover are sub-threshold. And I think that, being able to uncover data from a variety of sources will help us will end up leading us to make better decisions and make better games.
And again, it's the variety of sources that gets at me. So no one's ever suggesting we should just do physiological measures. They're saying, do all that stuff you were doing. Do the observation, do the metrics, collect some self-report questions after the fact, and we'll do metrics on top of it. So this is a sort of marginal method. You're adding on top of existing methodologies a little more work, a little more analysis, and hopefully finding more problems. And most of the industry has pretty much looked at this and said, no, the return on investment isn't there yet. And I can see a day when it's there, but most researchers in the industry sort of said it's not there yet.
Right. And I mean, I guess that's fine, although I don't know if most of the industry wants to be like most of the industry. I think we're all trying to figure out, better ways of doing what we're doing, right? And so, I mean, yeah, there are definitely costs to this, right? And, other, problems with each of these metrics, but I think or methodologies. But, I think, we found use out of it. So it's one example. So, take one data point for what it's worth. And I think going forward, people will see more value in at least, I don't think, if there was a way of unobtrusively gathering, quantifiable emotional data about how someone is playing a game, I think all of us in this room could visualize ways in which that could be useful, especially if it was in real time and mapped to game events that happened. It would help us make better games.
And the day it gets sort of more accurate than it is now, cheaper and less intrusive. I don't like gluing wires to my participants' heads. The day it gets there, I will absolutely use it. I just don't think it's there yet. Our last victim. Okay. So focus groups. So again, this is we're talking about structured group discussions. So bringing in a group of participants and talking about game concepts, talking about ideas. Unfortunately, this is another one where we're going to agree. Yeah. In that. I mean, the only times I've ever seen focus groups used usefully is for situations where you really have no idea how to approach a research problem. As your very first ultra exploratory moment of just saying, let's put somebody in a room and talk to them initially and use that to guide future research.
Can I interject real quick?
Yeah.
And if that's actually the case, then you probably shouldn't be at the company you're working for. But yeah, continue.
Yeah. But if you have a crazy situation, it's like, let's just start with an interview and see what we can do. It's a place to start. It's not a great place to start, but it does do something.
Yeah, I think, John and I are in total agreement on this one. Focus groups are essentially useless. It's really hard. We've never really gotten any valid, we've never actually decided to run one, and we've never seen valid data come out of other focus groups that we've seen run. It's really tough to get people to speak in the abstract about concepts that they cannot actually have in hand or play or consume. So you can make anything sound good. I can describe a gameplay concept to you, and you can be like, yeah, that sounds great, and then you can play it and it sucks, right? Because the execution is what matters. So again, useful maybe for idea generation, but we're in the games business. We should be the ones generating the ideas. So it's fine, if you want to maybe validate a hypothesis about something, but really,
no, it's not good for that.
I know, I was trying to be yeah.
But thank you for taking the bullet.
No, yeah. So this is one of the examples where Bill told us to lie. Focus groups are. It's really hard for people to speak, I guess, with validity about something they have yet to experience. And it's just something that's been validated across a variety of research for years now. People are just really bad at it, and so you have people coming into a room and a marketing person saying, "Hey, here's this really cool idea," or "Tell us what this really cool idea, if you like this really cool idea," and it becomes just collecting useless data. So,
and the other problem, if we can have the next slide, is that focus groups tend to be dominated by strong personalities. I think Keith mentioned this earlier, that you have 15 people in a room, you're not actually getting 15 people's worth of opinions. You're getting a couple of loudmouths who say, I hate this, and everyone else sort of goes, yeah, I hate that too. And so you only are getting a few opinions echoed between a lot of other people. So they tend to be misleading, and you think, oh, look, we focus grouped 50 people. Well, you actually only got 4 opinions out of that 50 people.
So I guess one admission I'll make is I've actually done one focus group. 2 I've done. One I actually thought was a reasonable thing. I was not actually trying to evaluate an idea. I was not trying to generate ideas. I was trying to find out what people would talk about after they played a game. And to figure out what one person would say to another person about the game, what would happen, say, on a forum, which is a large place where people talk, I attempted to simulate that by actually having people play the game and then have a conversation, because I want to see what ideas would come out and would rise to the surface. And I treated each focus group as a single entity. This group had this conversation, this group had another conversation, as opposed to try to break down what was said in any particular one. But that's where I thought I could reflect the phenomenon of group conversation well with a focus group. But that's not generally what we hear about in the industry. It's, do you like this picture? Everyone raise your hand. And there's some of the best experiments, or funniest anyway, in social psychology are, we can get you all to lie with about 70% accuracy on things that are wholly unsupportable. It's like, which line is longer? And like 99% get it correct when you ask individually. If you have the first person be a member of the scientific experiment and just lies, oh, B, clearly, you can actually get 70% of people after them to lie with you. So it's Schachter's a conformity experiment done in the 60s. So it has, if your phenomenon is mapping onto it, you can do it, but almost never do we want to do that. It's incredibly rare. In fact, I wasn't super happy at running it, but it actually was the technique that made sense for the moment. But anyway, yeah, we're going to agree on that one. Anyway, conclusion essentially is that you should pick your research method by your research question. That may sound really obvious and kind of stupid, but since I've been out of Microsoft, I have seen people pick their research method by the research method they did yesterday and not, in fact, acknowledge that some methods are better suited for some things than others. So this is sort of hitting on what Paul and Veronica were talking about earlier, is that there is a large variety, and you really should start discriminating, because that is a screw, and you are using a hammer on it. And yes, you will drive it into the board eventually. It'll just be messy, and there'll be a lot of byproducts you don't want. Or what's worse is it'll just get off kilter, and then you'll get bad data and never know it. And that's the biggest problem, is that you go back to the road signs analogy. It's like, if you're using the wrong method to get something, if you're using a method that's good at evaluating cognition, but in fact you're asking questions about emotion, you're going to get weird data. And then you're going to make a recommendation that in fact doesn't represent reality. Second thing is that poor research execution equals misleading data. This is something that was sort of glossed over, but you can screw up research in a million ways. Who here has ever gone through a survey and thought, I don't even know what they're asking me? And then sometime we've gone through a survey and said, okay, I know what they're asking, but nothing that I experience inside of me can I put in any bubble they've given me. No open-ended answer can fit anywhere. It's like I literally sometimes don't know what they're asking, and I sometimes don't know how to tell them what I'm feeling or thinking because they have not in any way arranged it for me that way. It's incredibly easy to screw up. You can't just go and slap down a $50 headset and say, ooh, I'm doing physiological measures. You're going to get bad data. You have to kind of know what you're doing. You can, just like a great game concept can be ruined by execution, a great research plan can be ruined by poor execution. And finally, good research in any method is probably better than no research. Again, good research executed well is going to get at the research question of interest. Now, whether you're asking all the research questions, separate topic. Whether you're asking the most important ones, separate topic. But you will, in fact, executed well, learn something that is, in fact, better than nothing. Right now, what you have is a very insular group who, despite their appearance, are actually very, very similar people. They're all professional game developers, all deciding what the wider world likes. And they do not reflect the wider world in any way, shape, or form. They reflect game developers. And so interjecting some evidence about what real gamers actually like and do is going to be better than not. And again, most of the art of this is figuring out what the most important questions to ask. And then once you figure out what the important questions are asked, is how to go about, in fact, getting that and delivering it to the team in a way that motivates them to make a change that benefits the players. So just real quick Q&A. There's a games user research SIG on LinkedIn groups. Just go and take a look at it. If you are interested in the topic and you're in the industry, please do sign up. And the second thing, if you're signed up for the MS Tour, please stay here, and we're going to do some organization for that happens. But anyway, we'll turn it over to Q&A now with the time we have left.
Since I didn't feel like you guys were very adversarial, may I ask kind of an adversarial?
Oh, please.
Sure.
How do the three of you, anyone can really answer, justify your existences? That is, has anyone ever done any return on investment to see what the actual benefit is in terms of additional sales or attention from gamers, et cetera, as opposed to not doing this kind of research?
I mean, it is tough to measure ROI on user research. In many cases, in some cases it's not. For example, finding usability problems in the installer for a game or in the demo it's very easy to draw a direct line of saying if you have a trial version of your game, and most players are quitting your trial within the first minute, it's very easy to draw a direct line from that to the number of people who will eventually buy the game and eventual profits. So there are places where it's easier and harder to make the argument, but in general, this is a way of making better games. And the hope that we all hope is that better games sell more copies.
Go ahead.
Real quickly, so I mean, at Valve, when I got to Valve, I was told go and be useful. That was it. And so, you know, we value utility and I guess ROI at Valve just by making good decisions. And so if we have better data, we'll make better decisions. And so we think that as long as we're making better decisions, then things will take care of themselves.
Infinite amount of money in this.
Yep.
So it has to be curtailed to whatever is
Well,
beneficial.
right, but it's you know, if I want to spend, you know, X dollars on an eye tracker, right, I have to convince people that, hey, we'll get X dollars worth of value out of it. It's not spending $1 million.
Afterwards and say, oh, we got $100,000 additional.
Awesome. May I? So my usual reaction to this question is I reject the question completely, because no one can. No one can tell me exactly how much one more programmer in the team will have ROI either.
True.
No one can tell me what one more manager will have as ROI. No one will tell me one more artist. It is a bizarre thing applied as a criterion for the new thing that is never in fact applied to the old thing. So I will switch to a different gear. I can say that. Something like 17 out of 19 people I've worked with once, they've worked with me again. They've often done it having absolutely no budget to do it, and they found a way to steal budget from other places to get it. Bungie, when they left Microsoft, decided that the user research that they got essentially for free from Microsoft was so valuable. How many people do you have now?
3.
He has 3 people on staff. That Ensemble, when they left Microsoft, the first thing they did is they built a usability lab and put someone of similar training in there. That people who routinely make ROI decisions are routinely investing in this, investing heavily. At one point, when I was at Microsoft, I had 35 researchers under me, covering about 62 titles. And at Microsoft, contrary to belief, there's more good ideas than money. But if you have a good idea at Microsoft, you can probably get it funded. And so we grew from 0 to 35 people in about 7 years. And so people who routinely make ROI decisions are routinely doing this once they become aware of it and once they taste it. Like usually what I say is I can get someone to do a single usability study with me, I have them as a client for life. Or at least someone else does if I screw up. So that is simply, I've not had a problem once they try it. Now there's a huge skepticism to get them to try it. And that's why investing in a very cheap version, like I'll do usability first because it's the cheapest form. And once they see it, then they always want more, and then they have additional questions, and that's when you start to grow. Yeah, so I think the skepticism is great. I just find it funny that ROI is only applied to new things like user research and not applied to every other discipline. Also,
to further clarify, so at Valve, playtesting is the single most important thing that we do, like by far. So if you ask someone like what, you know, the best use of their time, it will be running a playtest. It's just something that's built into the culture, and it's what we believe in is how we make better games. And so so I mean, like I don't need to justify my existence, right? Like my existence will help us, you know, with playtesting and will help us make better games because that's what we believe is the single most important thing. So it may be a philosophical difference in what the company is looking for, but to us it just makes sense to make better games. You need to actually put them in front of the players.
Right. Marty?
I just want to give you the anecdotal answer to the ROI question. Is Halo 1 tutorial people were dying in and we didn't know it until we did user testing, and I'm really glad that we did that because I can't even imagine what the return on investment was for that simple amount of user testing to figure out that if we had shipped that way, it would have been the end of that game. So that's like infinite in terms of its value. So.
David?
I agree, bug fixing is like the primary purpose of playtesting to make the quality of the product better. But it sounds like some of the methods that you're using, like eye tracking or physiological, the argumentation was, oh, it's too much information. We could maybe make it a more simple question to just make that product better. But I guess my question is, can you use this new data in a more, I guess, pure research orientation, kind of like the last topic, to actually have some of these questions drive like better game design mechanics or make better products or experiences for different franchises?
So absolutely, I don't even know if I want to draw the distinction between like current usability or playtesting or games user research and future R&D. I think. I mean, we're constantly doing research. I mentioned like the expert novice difference. We're interested in that. And that's going to inform future titles, right? And like things we gain, things we learn now that we may not fix are going to inform future titles. And then methodologies or questions we want answered that we can't do now are going to inform future titles. So we're always doing research. And so it's not really, we don't really have that distinction between the data we get from current playtests and the data we might get, might make use of in future playtests, I guess, or the research methods we might uncover for future playtests.
Yeah, and Randy. Go ahead. Sorry.
Do you think you can use professional game testers for to get unbiased results for user experience testing?
Hell no. Again, professional game testers are professionals. They're not playing the game the way a standard player would at home.
Yeah, we didn't talk about like participant sampling, but I mean, obviously understanding, there are a lot of advantages to drawing a random sample from the population, and a lot of advantages to drawing, a specific demographic that is going to play your game. But people who are playing games for a living, again, are going to be a non-naturalistic, and that is not something we want to avoid.
And if you want to just use people from in the building, use the admin staff, use the janitor, use anybody else, not the professional testers.
Yeah, Randy.
Another comment just on the ROI question, because it always does come down to the budget and the money. Another way that you can look at it, I think, is more effective, is kind of the total cost accounted for. You make an assumption that it is going to cost something, but relative to, and I'm talking big budget AAA titles, the cost of a user researcher and an eye tracker and gratuity or whatever it is that you're using is minimal compared to what it costs for a marketing person to go off to a Game Fest thing in Germany to do something random with a bunch of who the hell knows what. So if you have a good understanding about where the costs are being allocated within the business for the budgets to develop a game, and then you give them a, it's only going to cost you X thousand dollars, X $100,000, $200,000, or all had a number like that, and then you explain to them the promise of what you get for such a minimal cost. That is usually one of the big movers in terms of kind of getting in the door and then start gaining the momentum in terms of the value that you're bringing. And then on top of what Bill was saying, their behaviors start showing what the ROI is internally. They give you more, to do even more, and they ask you to even do additional things that you're not equipped to do. But just another metric that you can look at that's not just ROI.
Yeah.
I actually just wanted to turn back to the physio method real quickly. It seems like it's difficult to potentially interpret it, and I'm just curious, you mentioned negative arousal spikes, and especially in something like Left 4 Dead, a negative arousal spike could be a good thing in some contexts, fear, suspense, and I'm wondering how you parse that separately from frustration or other kinds of negative arousal spikes that are considered objective.
Right, so some of that I can't talk about. It's stuff that we've worked on. What we do try and do is any data that we collect physiologically, we're going to validate through other control experiments.
And that's actually, I think, notice the sleight of hand there. They're validating the physiological data through the other experiments. Okay, why did I need the physiological data in the first place? If I'm validating it through verbal report, if I'm validating it through telemetry and all that other stuff, the only marginal utility of the physiological stuff is what it would produce on top of all that other testing you're going to do. And I think it's not worth it. Mike says it is. It's still sort of an open question.
So so by validate, I didn't mean use verbal reports. I meant, so like let's talk about behavior, right? If someone says I like the game, right?
Behavior's fine.
Right. So someone I like the game, right? So with verbal reports, you could say, okay, maybe I believe you, maybe I don't, maybe you're trying to impress me or not. But if you run experiments, and again, this is it's you 5-10 hours, whatever, and you let people play the game, and you can actually measure engagement by behavior. How long are they playing the game when they can stop whenever they want? You can see if they're lying or not, and then you can map the arousal patterns you track when they're playing versus when they're constrained, and you can actually compute when they're. You can actually do fine-grained analysis and determine if the arousal patterns that match when someone is enjoying the game are the same as what you get in traditional playtests. So like by validation, I didn't mean use verbal reports. What you do with physiological measures is they tell you if the verbal reports are getting or people are telling the truth. That's what I was referring to. Is that?
So you're basically using it to weight their reported.
So you can't. It's a lot easier to fake words than it is to fake your physiological response. And so if you have a more objective
Come on,
measurement,
they've
then
been
you can
busted
do
on
that.
Mythbusters. I mean, there's a reason why lie detectors aren't accepted as legal testimony in most jurisdictions. It is possible to fake these measures.
Well-
it is possible to lie too in verbal reports, but they're trying to pretend that, okay, we have a machine, it's much more objective than a person. Well, kind of, no, sort of. Because there's a person at the other end of the machine, at either end of the machine, and there's a lot of interpretation on each end.
Yeah, well, I guess the lie detector argument is somewhat specious because I think the reason they're not allowed is because 90% accuracy in a court of law is not good when someone's facing a death penalty. But
They allow verbal reports.
what's that? Well, I mean, they eyewitness reports too, right?
But everything we know about verbal reports in law, they shouldn't be.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, and eyewitness reports obviously are actually notoriously, I guess, fallible, and actually probably should be disallowed in terms of if you look at research and what people have actually ended up kind of, I guess, the amount of wrongful convictions due to eyewitness reports are like, it's a very unfortunate thing. But in terms of measuring physiological arousal, yeah, maybe we're 85% accurate, right? But I would take 85% accuracy over someone with a lot more reasons to lie to me, I guess. Again, but these are complementary, right? I mean, I'm being strong about physiological measures, and verbal reports are great, but they're, it's, I guess, two sides of a coin. So,
Yeah.
I had a question primarily, I think, for Mike. What are the fundamental differences in your approach when you test, say, a game experience versus a service like Steam, the purchase experience, kind of finding games that you want, as opposed to how enjoyable a game is? Or do you kind of separate that out, that some people focus on user testing for games versus user interfaces for the storefront?
I mean, it just depends on what data we want. I mean, if a game is not ready for testing, or we have enough data on it, then we're curious about Steam stuff, then we'll go and do Steam stuff. Or it's just a question of allocating resource. I mean, I don't think there's no grand plan in terms of what we're doing. It's more like what questions are interesting to us and how do we answer them. And if it's a question about Steam, then we'll go and run maybe a controlled experiment on what's going on there. And if the games if we're getting close to shipping and we need to kind of bang on games, or we're testing out a new gameplay concept, then we'll go and collect data on that. So it's more just a question of what questions are most interesting us at the present time, and how do we best allocate resources?
I guess the question is more about how does your approach differ in terms of what kinds of things do you find most salient for, because most of this discussion has been about the user experience playing games, but just curious about how you get at the way people approach services like Steam.
Right. Well, so I mean, it's a variety of I guess different methods. It's always about, as Bill mentioned, and kind of like the hope that one of the takeaways of the talk is that you're going to use the method that is best suited for the data you're trying to extract. So if it's a question about users' preferences about Steam, then it might be a survey, right? And maybe we'll do a Steam survey. Or if it's a question about a new purchase path we're trying out, then we might do a usability study. If it's a question about just how people are consuming Steam, then we might just do a basic direct observation and maybe interrupt where needed or do a Q&A afterwards. So again, it ends up it's always question dependent.
And almost all these methods can be used equally well on those purchase behaviors. One of my favorite moments at Microsoft actually was testing the Games for Windows Live client that you could download, install, and play games. And at the end of a usability session, I asked every participant one question: what does the term client mean in this context? And almost every participant, without exception, looked at me and said, I'm the client. That's me. And it's just one of those terms that the people who built the tool, they never, of course, it's a client. It's a client app. That's what it is. But that's not how users actually thought of it, and caused a lot of confusion in the directions because of that.
Yeah, going back to the Think Aloud, you applied it to single-player gameplay experiences.
Yep.
In the multiplayer gameplay design, like thinking aloud is an integral part of most online gameplay. So how do you test for that? Like, 'cause obviously you're gonna have people just not talk to each other or have them all communicate, and obviously the sample group, if they communicate well, that can impact how they enjoy the experience.
Yep. There's a couple ways to get at it. One is just the player has a mute button and they're either talking to you or when they're muted, or they're talking to their teammates when it's unmuted, if you have them sort of playing online from the lab. The other thing is, in a multiplayer situation, you really don't have to use an explicit Think Aloud protocol. I mean, one of the best ways to test kids is to put two kids on a couch and let them play the game, and they will happily chatter away to each other about what they're playing, and just basically conduct a Think Aloud dialogue for you. You can just sit back and watch.
Right, yeah, because it was mentioned that one of the cons is that it's intrusive on the gameplay experience, and in a multiplayer setting, it is largely part of the gameplay experience.
Except when it's sort of, I mean, if it blocks me from communicating with my teammates because I'm busy talking to the researcher, then it would start to interfere. So there is you can go too far.
Right. Yeah. There's a distinction to be drawn between communicating and gameplay, which is not think aloud or not however you think aloud, versus having someone describe what they're doing. Right. Those are two completely separate ways of actually consuming the game.
Okay, and we're at times now. Sorry, if you have any additional questions, feel free to come up. And again, if you sign up for the tour, please come down and make sure you talk to me.